Thanks for the great introduction, Eric. I'm Mike, and at Yahoo, I'm the UI lead for a product called Ad Manager Plus. It's their next generation ad platform. It's an Ember app that we've been working on for about 2 years now, and has sort of spawned off 12 or 15 other Ember apps that are all built on the same tech stack, which includes Babel, Ember CLI, Bootstrap, Node, and hopefully I/O soon. So we've been at this for a while. What I'd like to talk about today, first I want to just go over some testing basics so we're all speaking the same language here. Then I'm going to dive into dissecting some of the helpers we're using for unit and integration tests. And I'm also going to cover how some of these add-ons like Ember QUnit and Embertest Helpers work under the hood, some things that you guys need to be aware of in order to keep from hitting some nasty snags as you upgrade and start building more complexity into your apps. And then I'm going to cover some test automation technology that you can put into use today for free for anything you have open sourced. So this is like world-class test automation, cross-browser, cross-device testing. It can be done in 10 or 15 minutes, and you'll be protected from regression in a big way. So get the terminology out of the way. Unit tests are really about testing algorithmic complexity. The ideal thing to test with the unit test is something like a function that has inputs and yields a particular output. You're always testing in isolation, and they should be fast, right? You should be able to blow through these quickly. Functional test, they test either a workflow or some acceptance criteria. You're going to be launching, your whole app or whole system and testing in context rather than testing in isolation. Integration tests are supposed to be for testing the integration points between components or systems. So a good example that probably is meaningful to this crowd is making sure API JSON contracts are what your single page app expects, right? So if an API, if an object loses a field that Ember is depending on and your app chokes because of it, this is the kind of test that you would want to have in place for that. And then finally, a more sort of subjective term, end-to-end test. These kinds of tests are for really going through the entire stack, opening a form on the UI, filling it out, clicking a button, persisting it through the API, verifying it hits the database and is actually ending up as a record there, and then watching it bubble all the way up. These are the slowest kinds of tests, and typically you want as few of these as you can get away with while maintaining release confidence. And that's what we're all after here. Not test coverage in number of lines, but establishing confidence that your app does what it's supposed to do and you're protected against regression in the future. So a little cheat sheet for Ember developers in particular. Which tool do you reach for when you're trying to test a given thing? So unit tests, think of the things in your utils folder. And the more you can move there, the more of your code base you can make unit testable, as opposed to keeping a massive computed property on a controller in the controller file. Now you have to test it with the controller and all of the complexity involved therein. So yeah, the closer you stick to this, from my experience, the more maintainable your test suite will be, and the better your release confidence will be over time. So getting into the Ember particulars now. So for those of you that write tests for your Ember apps, you're probably used to seeing something like this. So this is just a QUnit module. And there are other test frameworks like Chai and Mocha, and these are the things that give you the asserts. Pick whatever you like. They're all pretty much feature equivalent, but it's just sort of a style preference. In this case, a QUnit module, out of the box, without taking Ember into consideration, it does two important things. It groups a set of tests together that logically belong together, and it gives you a hook to set up and tear down each test in the module, sequentially. So if you're testing a model and you need certain records to be present in the store in order for your test to work, or in order for whatever's in this module to work, this would be a good single place to put it there, single place to put that logic, and you then would have whatever that setup is for every test that follows. Often overlooked, you can have multiple modules in one file in your test suite. So whatever logically makes sense in terms of grouping, in terms of what shares the common setup and teardown logic, you should go in that direction. All right, what Ember adds, and Embertest Helpers is a great addition to the QUnit module here. What Ember adds with module 4 model, module 4 component is it sets up an isolated container for a unit test with whatever you need in order to perform the test. So in the case of a component, it's going to find the component, the template that goes with the component, put those in the container so that when you call, this.render or this.subject, everything is there for you. And additionally, especially in the case of components, there is some special wiring that has to happen in order to get the context for your view set up properly, and that is another thing that this add-on does. Additionally, you see that below, using this needs option, you can bring in like subcomponents or related models if you're unit testing models, so that basically everything that your unit testable component needs in order to operate in as good of an isolation as you can get. This is how you bring other things in. All right, so moving on to integration tests, we've got two groups of helpers. We've got async helpers for what users do, and we've got sync helpers for what users see. Sync helpers, as you expect, they return values like current URL, will return a string. Async helpers return promises. So raise your hand in this room if you use async helpers in your integration tests or in your functional tests. Raise your hand if you sometimes end up with a massive chain of .then, .then, .then. All right.
Someone is lying, so there were not nearly enough answers.
Yeah, Steph thinks you all are lying, so. So we're going to get into how you can avoid the nested promise entanglement problem in a second. But I'd like to first set the stage with an example of a small app so we have some context and we know what we're testing here. So I built a small app here that it organizes a collection of shopping lists. So I've got my fruits and my vegetables, and clicking on fruits will drill into the view that you see on the right, and vegetables will bring up a separate list. You see how I have my route set up below, so I've got a top-level resource for lists to handle the list of lists. And then, just because of the way I wanted to set this up, I have a second resource for a single list so that that top-level view ends up getting swapped out. I did notice that when I tried to run it and did not update the example because I already pasted it in. But thank you for keeping me honest. Yeah, Steph is very shy. I know that from experience. So I'll show you this app working here so we can all, oh, it's terribly small. Right, so we've got fruits, drill into fruits, and go back. Vegetables, it's a different list. And I have a diagram of the API calls that are made because I can construct a little bit of a snag here. But here is a non-nested variant of an acceptance test. So what we have here are some of our async helpers. We have a visit, we have two and thens, and we have a click. What is actually happening under the hood? Oh, also I should point out the last line in this test logs to the console hello world. So what's happening under the hood is that Embertest Helpers is accumulating an array of promises, steps to run chained together, chaining each successive promise after the previous. So when you call visit and then call and then after it, what's actually happening is you get a head-to-tail connection there. It looks like sync code, but it's actually async code. So this is one of the things that we're wrestling with a little bit at Yahoo. We've tied ourselves into a mess with some projects. The console log will get printed to the screen before we actually transition to the drill into the shopping list. Although reading this, if you don't know the background, if you don't know that under the hood, you're constructing a promise chain, it might look otherwise. So simulating an API, this is another important part of writing good tests, right? You don't want to hit your API all the time. It's probably much slower than providing a synthetic response of some kind. So Trek, another Ember core team member, he's written two libraries, one before the other, and one is sort of the evolution of the other. One is called FakeHR, and the other is Pretender. And they take different strategies in order to solve this problem of synthesizing an API. FakeHR, it will resolve a pending request. So you actually have to have a request sent out before FakeHR can help you do anything about it. Pretender takes the approach of setting up something akin to a server in advance of running your tests, so that well, you'll see some advantages after I alter my implementation a little bit here. But in this particular case, I've used Ember Data's find coalescing in order to build this endpoint that returns the items in my list by ID. So I need information from the first response in order to send out the second request. And so we have a head-to-tail situation here. So looking at how we would write this test in FakeHR, and I have it deliberately clipped here because the important thing is the order. This is the same test that we saw before. Just click on a list, and you should find yourself at the page with just the fruit on it. So what we have to do is first send out the request to go, or first visit the page, which starts the transition, right, to that route. But that transition cannot complete until the model hook gets the data that it's listening for, right? So we have to then answer the first request. All right, and then we can make our first assert that we're actually on the page that we believe we should be on. And then we click the link to, and we have to provide a second request because at that time we're in a second transition where that promise won't resolve and we can't continue our promise chain until that request is satisfied. So in Pretender, you basically provide the same data in advance. You construct a server, and I noticed there's some leftover junk on the FakeHR example, so ignore those first three lines there. So you construct a server that knows how to respond to requests before they are sent out, right? And so you're sort of priming an API that knows how to provide what you need. And you can have whatever logic you want in these callbacks. They can respond to query params. They can, you can open up a hole in the override of AJAX that will actually let certain requests go through. But there's much less sensitivity to order here. I don't have to worry about what has to come first and then what comes after. So if I were to add some animation, something foreign to Ember that happened when I clicked that link, you can end up having no choice but to put little set timeouts in your tests, because who knows whether that request is sent out at the moment that you click. It might be an action that has to do something and then finally send a request out. And there's really no hard promise that the framework makes that these things will that when you're done with the sync part of the click handler, with the click helper, that you're going to be in a position to fulfill a pending request. So you end up with set timeouts everywhere. You end up with lots of extra stuff in your tests that is really just trying to brute force your way into something reasonable. Whereas the example on the right wouldn't have to change at all.
One really good example is if you click visits, links, lists, which fetches lists, and then the result of that fetches something else. And for each one that you add, you have to add one more like set timeout and a set timeout in the first example.
Yep, exactly. So and like a setup controller that doesn't wait for something to resolve. There's no telling when these things may be ready to resolve. But on the right, the pretender example would remain unchanged because it doesn't care when things happen. It just knows that whenever they happen, this is what I do. So if I were to change my API such that instead of needing individual item IDs, I could get all of the items for a given list, meaning that by the time I have a line ID, which is part of the dynamic segment of that route, I'm in a position to send both requests out. I would have to go and change my test because now it's trying to fulfill that second request too early. I'm sorry, it's trying to fulfill that second request too late. You're never going to get to that point. And you're going to constantly be adjusting your tests when you refactor, adjusting your tests again. All right, so moving on to some of the more fun stuff. This is all about free stuff for your open source, free stuff for your add-ons. So who knows who this guy is at the top? Awesome. That's Travis. Travis gives you a free CI pipeline if you have an open source project. They're exceedingly easy to set up. If you use Ember CLI, or I believe if you started with AppKit, there is a baked-in Travis configuration. It's the .travis.yml file. And everyone follows the same pipeline here. So it clones your code. It checks out the given commit, whether you're on a branch or whether it has to do some merging to evaluate a potential PR. And then you have all of these hooks. And here are examples of things you might want to do on these hooks. So before install, Phantom.js 2.0 is available on Travis, but it's not the default. So you have to add something to path in order for that to be what is first resolved. That's a great thing to put in before install, before you start doing anything. Install by default does npm install and bower install, and if you're using Ember CLI, it's also turning off the little spinny cursor so that it doesn't pollute the hell out of your log files. Before script runs immediately before your tests start to run. Script is actually the act of running the tests. Then you have hooks for success and failure, and then finally, a finally. So this is my pro tip for Travis for the evening. How many people know about Ember Try? Only a few hands. Ember Try lets you test your app or add-ons against multiple versions of the Ember framework. It works pretty much out of the box. It's just some clever changing your bower.json, bower install, and then restoring things back to normal when everything's done. So you could, if you're on 110 or you're building an add-on that you want to be compatible from 110 through Canary, you can actually run your test suite against each version of the framework sequentially, and only in the event that everything passes will you consider this to be a successful build. What we can do here is put in our Travis configuration a build matrix, which essentially it breaks the build up into separate tasks, one for each version of the framework, and they'll all run in parallel. And here we even have said that failures are allowed in Canary, right? So even if there's some breakage, let's say you're still working on it, there's a framework bug that you're still trying to fix, You can tolerate canary failures and still have builds regarded as passing. And we don't even wait for it to complete running. So even if you didn't want to really provide support for other versions of Ember, at least you'll know where you stand when you want to upgrade, right? We could just as easily say, I only want to run the tests against the version of Ember that I have in my Bower. Everything else, let's run it, but let's just disregard those results, and I'll look into them every so often and keep track of whether we're getting worse or whether we're getting better. But this really comes at no cost. Travis will often run all of these at the same time, and things will still be pretty fast. So this Travis setup will be the default for add-ons in the next version of Ember CLI. So if you update, you should pull this in, and I suggest you guys take it for a test drive. Sauce Labs. So I like giving talks because it forces me to kind of go and research things, and I want to have something cool to share with people. So I learned a lot about Sauce Labs over the past 2 weeks. They have a massive browser farm, and they have a program called OpenSauce, which lets you test against a variety of browsers for free. You set this up, integrate it with Travis pretty easily. On the top here, you see there's Ember CLI Sauce, which makes this even easier. And you can test against Windows. I know most of us probably develop on Macs, and so Windows is an afterthought unless you put something like this in place, and then you can at least be alerted to when you have problems. And you also get cross-device testing. So with a couple little hacks, you have to, for some reason it doesn't run on localhost, and this is a known issue for Sauce Labs. With a couple changes to your configuration file, you can have this running on Android, you can have this running on OS X, on iPad. Hopefully we'll have the Ember framework tested against various versions of iOS pretty soon. So this will help really make sure that your add-ons and your apps are actually going to work on mobile devices. And there's surprising little gotchas with some of the older 32-bit iOS devices that you got to stay on top of. Just a reminder, it's free. There's no excuse not to use it. At least plug it in and set it up. Take the 5 minutes and give it a whirl. There are some other tools here like Code Climate and Coveralls that deal with code quality and test coverage. InchCI, they can help you track your progress, documenting your code. So they'll sort of give you a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or a so-so on each method, like how thorough the documentation is. We have a great ecosystem here and some amazing add-ons, and if we're going to help push people to stay up to date on the framework and make our own lives easier, it's important that we go out and help make sure that all of our dependencies are staying up to date as well. So, put this on your own stuff, go find an add-on that you like, and if you see that something here is missing, I've done this with a few. It is always very appreciated if you say, here's your configuration, I set it up for you. And oftentimes you'll catch some critical problems, and that makes your own stuff better. All right, that's all I have. Thanks.
Questions for Mike? If you guys have questions, you can come up to this microphone here so that our lovely viewers at home can listen in. No? No questions? There we go. Yep. Walk up right here.
Hey, what do you use internally for continuous integration?
Don't
ask.
Something that is not as fast or as good as Travis.
Okay. Yeah, because we have that problem a
Said
lot
every
too.
big company ever. Yeah.
Yes. But anything that we can manage to open source, we recently open sourced a dashboard for one of our data indexing layers, and man, we use Travis for anything that is external.
Do you have any advice for using like Jenkins to do some of this stuff?
There are some plugins for Jenkins. I know, like, I think Circle CI is a service that lets you hook up to Jenkins more easily, but I've never used raw Jenkins with a single page app before. It's always been something on top of Jenkins that makes it less painful.
Thanks. Oh, cool.
Netflix guys know what
Yeah,
they're
it's
talking
definitely
about.
possible and easy to do front-end testing with Jenkins. So the short version of that is just use create a Jenkins task that just runs a shell script and just have it call Embertest, which is built in Ember CLI. That's probably one of the easier ones. You should stand up to them. Stefan Penner,
There's a bunch of documentation
Stefan
around
Penner,
testing.
notable Ember CLI contributor, has said that there's a bunch of documentation on what ember-cli.com.
Testum
Yeah,
and Jenkins.
Ember CLI uses Testum, and so you can integrate Testum with Jenkins, and
Yep.
those problems have been solved.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.